The new house should have felt like a fresh start. It was meant to be a blank canvas for Megan and Liam, a place to build their future. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it had everything they needed. A spacious yard, a cozy fireplace, even a quaint basement perfect for storage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. The kind of house that promised safety, warmth, and memories to be made. But from the moment they crossed the threshold, something about the house felt off. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Every old house creaks, every home has drafts, and every house has its quirks. But the oddities were persistent. Doors would rattle as if someone was trying to get in when the wind was calm. A light in the hallway flickered, though they had replaced the bulb twice. There was an eerie chill that clung to the air, stubbornly lingering even when the furnace was cranked high. It wasn't cold exactly, but rather a deep-seated feeling of wrongness that sank into their bones. Megan joked about it at first, trying to ease the growing tension. Maybe it's haunted, she'd say with a forced laugh, but neither of them really believed it. Not then. They were practical people, rational. But as the days went by, the laughter faded, leaving only an unspoken sense of dread that settled between them. It wasn't until the third week, when they were organizing the basement, that things took a darker turn. The basement was mostly unfinished, just cement floors, bare brick walls, and exposed pipes overhead. It was cluttered with the remnants of the previous owner's life. Forgotten boxes, old furniture, and an antique shelving unit pressed against the far wall. Liam worked to clear a path through the mess, while Megan inspected the shelves, trying to decide if they were worth keeping. As she moved a box, the shelf groaned under the weight. It tilted, revealing something strange. "Liam," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a door behind the shelf. The door was old, far older than the rest of the basement. The wood was weathered, its paint cracked and peeling, and the handle was rusted. What struck them both immediately was how out of place it looked. The door didn't match the house's modern renovation style. It didn't match anything at all, and it wasn't in the blueprints. "Maybe it's a storage closet," Liam suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. Megan felt a knot form in her stomach. The house was old, sure, but this door seemed different. Almost forgotten. They hesitated for only a moment before deciding to open it. Curiosity outweighed caution. Liam gave the handle a hard twist, the rusted mechanism protesting loudly as it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At first glance, the room was unremarkable. It was little more than a narrow, empty space, perhaps 6 feet wide. The walls were bare, save for strange carvings etched deep into the wood. Symbols neither of them recognized, a language lost to time, but it wasn't the symbols that held their attention. No, it was the mirror. The mirror stood at the far end of the room, framed in heavy, ornate metal. Its surface was dulled with age, the glass slightly warped. A thin layer of dust clung to the edges, but when Megan wiped it away, the glass beneath was strangely cold, like ice. "What the hell is this?" Megan whispered, stepping closer. Liam didn't answer. He was staring at the carvings on the wall, his brow furrowed in confusion. "These symbols, they don't look like anything I've ever seen," he muttered, his fingers tracing the strange markings. The lines were sharp and chaotic, almost angry in their design. "Do you think it's part of the house's original structure? Like a leftover from the old owner?" Megan asked, her voice low as she gazed at her own reflection in the mirror. It was just her, at first. But as she leaned closer, something about the reflection seemed off. Her image in the glass seemed slightly delayed, her eyes catching the light in a way that felt unnatural. "Weird," she muttered under her breath, stepping back. Liam moved beside her, looking into the mirror himself. Their reflections stood side by side, perfectly still. Yet something about the moment felt wrong. The weight of the room pressed down on them, and for the first time, they both felt it. An oppressive force that seemed to creep in from the shadows, curling around the edges of their minds like a cold fog. Without speaking, they agreed to leave the room, pulling the door shut behind them, the rusty latch groaning one last time as it locked. That night, Megan couldn't sleep. The house was silent, but her mind raced with unease. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mirror, saw her own reflection, grinning at her with a smile that didn't belong to her face. She tossed and turned, Liam asleep beside her, oblivious. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were worse than the silence. She was back in the room. The mirror was there, but this time, her reflection was not. Instead, she saw another version of herself. One with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a wicked smile. Standing beside her, a version of Liam, equally distorted, his features warped and cruel. They didn't move, didn't speak, but she could feel their malice, their intent. They were waiting for something, waiting to step through the glass. She awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The image of her twisted reflection still burned into her mind. Liam stirred beside her, but didn't wake. It's just a nightmare, she told herself. But even as she repeated it, she knew something had changed. The house no longer felt like their own. The days after discovering the hidden room were filled with a palpable tension. Megan could feel it hanging over the house like a fog, thick and oppressive. The oddities they had initially brushed off, the flickering lights, the subtle creaks, seemed to grow worse, more frequent. Even Liam, who had been the rational one, was starting to grow uneasy, though he refused to admit it outright. The hidden room had a way of gnawing at them, pulling their thoughts back to it, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it. And the mirror, that cursed mirror, its image flickering behind Megan's eyes every time she blinked. It wasn't just a mirror, it was something more, something that watched. One evening, they decided they could no longer avoid it. "We should figure out what those symbols mean," Liam said, his voice flat as he stared at his laptop. Maybe they're just part of some old design. But Megan could tell he didn't believe his own words. Together, they went down to the basement. The door to the room was still shut, the air around it unnaturally cold. Liam hesitated for a moment before opening it, the rusty latch grating in the silence. The room inside was just as they'd left it. The mirror stood at the far end, dark and unmoving, and the strange carvings etched into the walls seemed to pulse in the dim light of their flashlights. They moved closer to the mirror, and Megan's heart began to pound in her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was just an object, a piece of glass and metal, nothing more. But as they stood in front of it, side by side, the reflection staring back at them felt wrong. It wasn't immediate. At first, their reflections were perfectly normal, mirrored images of themselves standing in that eerie room. But then, Megan noticed it. A subtle delay, barely perceptible at first. When she tilted her head, her reflection followed, but a fraction of a second too late. Liam noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the glass. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight. Megan nodded slowly, her breath shallow. She glanced at Liam's reflection and froze. His mirrored self was staring at her. Not at his own reflection, not at the room behind them, but directly at her. And then, it smiled. A slow, creeping grin that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Neither of them had smiled. "Liam," Megan breathed, stepping back from the mirror. Her reflection did the same, but the smile on her doppelganger's face lingered, curling like a predator's grin. "What the hell is this?" Liam muttered, pulling her back further. His eyes remained locked on the glass, as if daring the reflection to do something else. For a moment, everything was still, the silence in the room stretching unbearably. But then the reflection changed. It was subtle at first, the edges of the glass warping, distorting the image. The figures in the mirror, Megan and Liam, seemed to shift, their faces twisting into grotesque versions of themselves. Their eyes darkened, their mouths widened into ghoulish smiles that didn't belong to human faces. Megan's pulse raced as she reached for Liam's arm, her voice shaking. "We need to go." But Liam, transfixed by the mirror, took a step closer. The glass in front of him trembled, a hairline crack forming in the center, spidering out like veins. "Megan, look." His voice was low, almost hypnotic, as if something within the mirror had called to him. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the surface of the crack. In that moment, the reflection of his hand reached back, grabbing him. A cold, pale arm shot through the glass, its fingers curling around his wrist. Liam gasped, stumbling backward, but the pull was strong. Megan screamed and yanked him away, her heart slamming in her chest as she dragged him out of the room, the door slamming shut behind them. For a moment, They just stood there, both of them breathing hard, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. That wasn't just a reflection, Megan finally whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck. It tried to pull you in. Liam's face was pale, his expression unreadable as he stared at the door. "There's something behind that mirror," he murmured, his voice flat. "Something wrong." They both knew it wasn't over. The mirror was more than just an object. It was a doorway, a crack in reality. But to where? And what had tried to reach through? Over the next few days, Megan and Liam could barely think about anything else. They pored over old books and scoured the internet, searching for any information about strange mirrors, portals, or the symbols on the walls of the room. But they found nothing. No explanation for what they had seen, and no way to understand what had tried to cross over. The house itself seemed to shift, reacting to their fear. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, and doors they had closed would be found open in the morning. Objects moved from one place to another, and the cold, once subtle, began to seep into every corner, a bone-deep chill that no heater could chase away. Megan tried to focus on their research, but it became impossible to ignore the changes in Liam. He was still Liam. He looked like him, sounded like him, but something about him had shifted. He spoke more softly now, his gaze lingering on her longer than usual, as though he was studying her. There was a coldness in him, a distance that hadn't been there before. At first, Megan thought she was being paranoid. After all, they had both been through something terrifying. Anyone would act strangely after that. But as the days passed, the unease gnawed at her. It was the little things that stood out, the way he held her hand. It was too firm, almost possessive. The way he spoke to her in clipped sentences, as if choosing his words carefully, and the way his eyes seemed to lose warmth, turning cold whenever he thought she wasn't looking. One night, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. A soft glow came from beneath the door, and Megan crept through the house, her heart in her throat. She found him standing in the basement, in front of the door to the hidden room. He was staring at his reflection in the mirror, his face illuminated by the cold, silver light of the glass. But the reflection wasn't his. The version of Liam staring back at her was twisted, its features cruel and dark. And it was smiling. She wanted to scream, but something stopped her. She backed away silently, her breath shaky, her heart pounding in her chest. That's not Liam, she realized with growing horror. It's never been Liam since that day. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she returned to bed, her body trembling as she lay awake in the dark, the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. Megan knew she was losing Liam, little by little. The changes had been subtle at first, his voice slightly lower, his gaze lingering on her too long. Small, unsettling things that could be explained away by stress or exhaustion. But recently, the differences were becoming harder to ignore. The way he touched her now, almost mechanical, as if he were mimicking Liam's affection, the strange, clipped tone in his voice. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head, that the mirror hadn't really done anything. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the man who lived with her wasn't entirely Liam anymore. She'd started to wonder if the real Liam was even still there. Then, one night, he announced that he was going to run some errands, a vague excuse that sent a chill through her. His words were normal, but the tone felt off, hollow. Megan didn't stop him. In fact, the moment he left, a wave of relief washed over her, as if a pressure she hadn't realized was there had been lifted. Now that she was alone, she could no longer ignore the gnawing dread that had been building inside her. She had to confront the mirror. Her footsteps echoed through the basement as she made her way to the hidden room, the air colder with every step. She hesitated at the door, heart pounding in her chest, but something inside her pushed her forward. This is it. If I don't do something now, I'll lose him forever. The room was just as she'd left it. The mirror stood at the far end, its surface dark and warped. The strange carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the dim light, pulsing faintly as if alive. But it was the reflection in the mirror that held her attention, a distorted version of herself staring back at her. Megan stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection didn't move in time with her. It lagged, then smiled, a slow, twisted smile that curled her stomach with dread. This isn't just a reflection, she thought, her pulse quickening. The woman in the mirror was no longer a copy of her. She had become something else, something dark, something hungry. As if reading her thoughts, the doppelganger began to move, stepping toward the glass. Megan's heart pounded in her ears as the reflection pressed its hand against the surface, cracks forming beneath its fingers. The sound of glass splintering echoed through the room, the cracks spreading outward like a spider's web. "You know what's coming, don't you?" the reflection whispered, its voice cold and mocking. "He's not your Liam. He's never been." Megan felt her stomach drop, the words sinking in like ice. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The doppelganger's smile widened, cruel and sharp. The moment he stood in front of the mirror, he was mine. I've been waiting, slipping through little by little, but tonight, I'm taking what's mine. The cracks in the glass deepened, spreading like veins of corruption across the mirror's surface. "Liam has been fighting me, but I've been with you this whole time." Megan staggered backward, her mind reeling. That's why he's been acting so strange. The real Liam had been resisting the mirror's pull all along, but the doppelganger had been slowly taking control. And now, it was ready to fully cross over. Just then, Megan heard a noise behind her, the basement door slamming open. Her heart leapt into her throat. Liam was back, but it wasn't relief she felt, it was dread. She spun around just in time to see Liam standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. But something was off about him. He wasn't moving like the Liam she knew. His steps were too smooth, too deliberate. His smile, that twisted, unnatural smile, spread across his face like a predator about to pounce. "I told you," the doppelganger whispered from the mirror, its voice a low hiss. "He's been mine for a while now." Megan's blood ran cold as she backed away from the approaching figure. Her heart raced as she realized she was trapped. That isn't Liam. It was the doppelganger, the creature from the mirror, finally crossing over. But then, just as the figure reached her, something strange happened. The twisted smile faltered. Liam, or whatever was pretending to be him, seemed to hesitate, as if something inside him was fighting back. From behind, a second sound, footsteps, frantic and heavy, echoed through the house. The real Liam burst through the basement door, his face pale and his eyes wide with horror. "Megan!" he shouted, rushing down the stairs. "Get away from it!" Megan's mind spun. Two versions of Liam now stood in front of her, one with that twisted smile, the other filled with terror. For a split second, she didn't know who to trust. But the hesitation didn't last long. She could see it now. The real Liam. The fear in his eyes as he rushed toward her. The doppelganger, now fully aware of the real Liam's presence, snarled, its features twisting further as it lunged at her. The basement erupted into chaos. Liam and Megan fought desperately against the creature, their bodies slamming against the walls as the doppelganger lashed out with inhuman strength. It was faster than either of them, more vicious, as if fueled by the darkness of the mirror. It mocked them as they fought, taunting them with every move. But Liam, the real Liam, was fighting with everything he had. And Megan, driven by the terror of losing him forever, managed to shove the doppelganger back toward the mirror. With a final, desperate push, Liam and Megan forced the doppelganger against the cracked glass. The mirror splintered further, the cracks widening until the surface gave way, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The creature screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman, as it was pulled back into the void beyond the glass. For a moment, the room was still. Megan and Liam collapsed to the floor, breathing hard, their bodies trembling from the struggle. The mirror lay in ruins, shards of glass scattered around them. But as she caught her breath, she made the mistake of looking back at the broken mirror. Her heart froze. Through the cracks in the glass, she saw not just one reflection, but dozens. Dozens of versions of herself and Liam, twisted and warped, standing just beyond the shattered surface. Some were older, others younger, their faces marked with the same twisted smiles as the doppelgangers they had just fought. And through the largest crack, the figures in the mirror began to move. They were stepping closer, their hands reaching through the broken glass. The mirror may have shattered, but the portal was still open. Liam followed her gaze, his face paling as the reflection of their darkest selves moved ever closer. the nightmare wasn't over.